Have you ever wanted to disappear? Not from the law, not from people you hate, but from everything? To vanish into a place so quiet that the only thing left to listen to is your own heartbeat? That's exactly what I did 7 years ago. My name's Evan Mercer, and after my divorce, I drove north until the pavement ended. Past Spokane, past the signs warning about black bears and snow chains, I found an old logging road that led deep into the forgotten wilds of northern Washington. There, surrounded by 43 acres of pine, cedar, and fog, I built a new life, or maybe a new version of myself. The cabin wasn't much when I bought it. Just 4 walls, a leaky roof, and a smell of old smoke. But it was mine. No neighbors, no traffic, no ex-wife, no noise. The nearest town was 18 miles away, a place called Dry Creek that had one diner, one gas pump, and a post office that closed for lunch whenever it felt like it. The mail lady thought I was insane to live alone out here. Maybe she was right. I hunted. I fished. I grew vegetables in a patch of stubborn dirt behind the cabin. In the summer, the air smelled of pine resin and damp moss. In winter, the snow piled high enough to swallow my front steps. And for 7 years, the forest and I lived in a quiet truce. I respected its rules, and it let me stay. I knew every sound. The way the trees groaned in wind, how owls screamed when hunting, the soft thud of deer hooves on frozen soil. And when the night came, I listened to the stillness. The kind that seeps into your bones until you start to wonder if you've turned into part of the forest yourself. I'd seen plenty of wildlife, bears, elk, even a mountain lion once, crossing the trail like a shadow with eyes that didn't blink. But never had I felt fear. The woods were predictable, honest in their way. A bear would warn you before it charged. A cougar wouldn't come near unless it was starving. The forest didn't pretend. Until that June evening. That's when the silence changed. It was a still afternoon. The lake mirrored the sky like glass. No wind, no ripples. Only the hum of mosquitoes and the distant croak of frogs. I remember thinking how quiet it was, even for here. No birdsong, no rustling. Just silence that felt too deep, too deliberate. Then I saw it. Across the lake, near the far shore, something moved, slow, upright, heavy. At first, I thought it was a hiker who got lost. Nobody came out here, but sometimes people tried. They saw the lake on a map, imagined camping or fishing, and underestimated what 18 miles of wilderness really meant. But this figure wasn't carrying a pack. It wasn't wearing bright colors or any color I could name. It was tall, broader than any man should be. And its stride, it didn't match the rhythm of a human walk. It was smoother, heavier, like a shadow gliding through fog. I froze on my porch, rifle leaning by the door. My first thought wasn't fear. It was curiosity, that strange, dangerous kind that gets people killed in the woods. I lifted my binoculars. What I saw made my heart slow to a crawl. It wasn't a man. It was covered in dark, matted hair from shoulders to knees, skin thick, like leather where it wasn't fur. 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its arms were long, reaching almost to its knees. And the head, sloped, massive, framed by a jaw that could break a tree branch. It was kneeling by the water, cupping its hands to drink. My first rational thought was, bear on 2 legs. But no bear has hands like that. And no bear drinks like that. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, called someone. But there was no someone. No phone service. No neighbor. No reason to believe anyone would even believe me. So I grabbed my rifle and stepped down from the porch. Each step toward the lake felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath, watching. When I got within 50 yards, the creature moved again. It didn't turn around, didn't seem startled, just said, in a deep, gravelly voice that stopped my heart, "You hiding?" My knees nearly gave out. It had spoken. English, rough, broken, but clear. It turned its head slightly, revealing one dark, intelligent eye. Then another word came, strange and foreign in tone. Mino. I didn't know if it was a name, a greeting, or a warning, but the sound vibrated in my chest like thunder. And then, slowly, it lifted its hand, not as a threat, but as if inviting me closer. That's when I realized, whatever this thing was, it knew I was there the entire time. For a long moment, Neither of us moved. The rifle in my hands suddenly felt ridiculous, like holding a toy gun in front of a storm. I lowered it. I don't know why, but he felt right, sat cross-legged by the water, massive shoulders hunched forward, eyes fixed on me. I could see his face now, framed by thick hair that hung like a mane. It wasn't monstrous. It was ancient. Deep-set eyes, a broad nose, a mouth that seemed too human for the rest of him. His expression wasn't aggressive, just curious. Calm, even gentle, the way an old wolf might look at a younger one, deciding whether to bite or not. My throat was dry. I tried to speak, but all I managed was a hoarse whisper. "Who are you?" His head tilted, as though searching the air for meaning. Then, slowly, he tapped his chest and said, "Mino." That word again. Mino. A name. I nodded, pointing to myself. "Evan." He repeated it, awkward, drawn out, as if testing the sound on his tongue. "Evan." A strange smile flickered across his face. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Two beings from different worlds, sharing silence that meant more than words ever could. The wind finally returned, rippling the lake. Birds started calling again, cautious at first. Then Mino stood. I flinched, but he only glanced toward the trees, his massive frame blending into the shadows like he'd always belonged there. He looked back once more, then disappeared without a sound. Not a branch snapped. Not a leaf stirred. I stood there until dusk, trying to convince myself it was real. When I finally walked back to the cabin, the forest felt alive in a new way. Aware, alert, almost protective. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing that voice in my head. "You hiding?" Was he talking about the trees? Or about me? The following days were strange. I checked the shoreline, the trail, even the old deer paths. No footprints, no broken branches, no trace that something that large had ever been there. But I knew what I'd seen. You don't imagine something like that. I started sleeping lighter, waking at every sound. The forest has a rhythm you get used to. The creak of trees, the chirp of crickets, the distant crackle of raccoons raiding. But now, there was something new between the sounds. A pause, a breath, a feeling of being observed. 3 nights after the sighting, the wind picked up. The cabin groaned as it always did, but beneath the howl, I heard a thud. Then another, heavy, deliberate, pacing near the lake. I stepped outside with my lantern. The air was cold enough to make the flame tremble. The lake reflected only darkness. Then a voice came from somewhere near the tree line. Low, deep, patient. "Evan." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. Just steady. My lantern shook in my hand. He'd come back. I didn't move closer, and neither did he. But that night, for the first time since my divorce, I didn't feel completely alone. Terrified? Yes. Confused? Absolutely. But not alone. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It was speaking, and I had no idea what it was trying to tell me. Have you ever had a moment that redefines what real means? When the world you think you know suddenly folds, and something ancient looks back at you from the other side. For me, that moment didn't end at the lake. It only started there. The morning after I heard Mino call my name, I walked to the water's edge before sunrise. Mist hovered above the surface, thin and silver in the first light. My breath made clouds. Everything smelled like wet pine and memory. I didn't expect to see him again. Creatures that big don't hide, they vanish. Still, I found myself scanning every tree line, every ripple. My rational brain wanted to label it hallucination, isolation, trauma. But none of those words matched the footprints I found in the mud. Wide, deep, human-shaped, but far too large. 7 feet of proof. I followed the trail a few yards before it ended in the grass. It was as if he'd simply melted into the forest. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was electric, like the woods were whispering just out of reach. By mid-afternoon, I was restless. I went fishing to settle my nerves. Sitting at the dock, line in the water, I told myself I'd imagined it all, that I'd been too long alone. Then, a ripple spread across the lake, not from my cast, but from something big beneath the surface. My pulse kicked. The trees shifted. There he was. Mino stood at the far bank, half hidden in the shade, watching. Not stalking, not sneaking. Just there, like he'd been part of the scenery all along. I froze. He didn't move, but then he lifted one enormous hand and did something unexpected. He waved. A slow, deliberate peace gesture. Palm out, fingers spread. The universal sign that says, I come without harm. So I raised my hand and did the same. For the first time since my divorce, I smiled. A real one. Mino made a sound. Low, guttural, something between a hum and a growl. Then, in his rough English, he said, "Fish good." It took me a second to realize what he meant. Then he pointed, not at me, but toward a bend in the lake where the water glimmered brighter. "Fish good," he repeated, then gestured for me to follow. Curiosity won over fear. I reeled in my line and crossed the narrow bridge toward him, every step echoing with adrenaline. When I reached the bend, I saw what he meant. Dozens of rainbow trout, flashing under the surface like liquid silver. A secret spot I'd never found in 7 years living here. Mino gave a deep, rumbling laugh, not loud, but genuine, and tapped his chest again. Mino. Then, pointing to the water. Good. And then to me. You learn. That was the moment I realized. Whatever he wasn't an animal. He was a teacher. For the next few minutes, we didn't talk. We just fished. I cast my line where he'd pointed, and sure enough, the trout hit like fireworks. Mino watched, grinning in his strange, subtle way, then crouched beside me. He didn't use a rod. He waited, motionless, until the faintest ripple touched the surface. Then snap. His hand struck the water faster than my eyes could track. When he lifted it, a full-grown trout writhed between his fingers. He placed it beside mine, like an offering. Share, he said. That one word, short, sharp, carried a weight no dictionary could capture. We ate together on the shore, my little campfire crackling. I seasoned my fish with salt. He ate his raw, chewing with slow patience. Between bites, he studied me like I was the mystery. Every time I spoke, he watched my mouth carefully, repeating words under his breath. Fish. Fire. Good. Yes. No. When I asked how he'd learned English, he tapped his ear and said, Listen. Watch. Then, pointing to his head, Keep. I laughed softly. You mean, you remember. He nodded once, satisfied with the new word. Remember. Something about that moment felt sacred. Two beings from opposite ends of the world sharing the oldest language of all, patience. The sun sank behind the ridgeline, and the lake turned to bronze. He stood then, towering over me like a redwood tree, and said, almost gently, Go. Dark come. And just like that, he was gone again. No sound, no trail, only the echo of his voice, and the faint scent of wet earth where he'd stood. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wrote everything down in my journal. Every word, every gesture, every sound. I didn't know what I was documenting, but it felt important, as if this connection meant more than I could yet understand. Because deep down, I wasn't just learning about him. I was remembering something about myself, the part that still believed in wonder. Days passed, and I didn't see Mino again. But I felt his presence everywhere, in the crackle of branches, the faint scent of moss, the way the air shifted when I stepped outside. It wasn't fear anymore. It was companionship I couldn't explain. So I started leaving things by the lake. Small gestures. A strip of dried venison. A handful of apples. A shiny fishing lure. Offerings, I guess. Not because I expected anything in return, but because gratitude demanded action. One morning, I found something waiting for me. Beside the fire pit lay a bundle wrapped in bark. Inside were wild roots, berries, and what looked like amber hardened around a clump of moss. When I touched it, it smelled faintly sweet, like sap and rain. And attached to the bundle was a tuft of coarse, brown hair. Minos. It hit me like a wave. This wasn't random. It was reciprocity, a conversation without words. That afternoon, I was chopping wood when a branch fell from above and smacked me square on the head. Not hard, just enough to make me swear. From the trees came a deep, amused grunt. I looked up. Mino stood halfway up a slope, half hidden behind a cedar trunk, eyes bright with what could only be described as laughter. He had thrown it. Funny, I muttered, rubbing my scalp. You think that's funny? He rumbled low in his chest, something like a chuckle, and nodded. Funny. And for the first time since my marriage fell apart, I laughed too. Laughed until my sides hurt, until the forest echoed with the sound of it. When I finally caught my breath, Mino pointed at me and said softly, "You, not hide now." The words landed heavier than I expected, because he was right. For years, I'd been hiding, from pain, from people, from myself. But here I was, laughing with a creature that shouldn't exist, and somehow, I'd never felt more seen. Our encounters became a rhythm, irregular but familiar. He'd appear near the lake, or by my garden, or sometimes just at the edge of the clearing as I chopped wood. Always watching, sometimes speaking. He showed me things I'd never noticed in 7 years living there. Plants that stopped bleeding, roots that cured headaches, a cave that held crystals glowing faintly in moonlight. He knew the forest the way I know my own scars. Once, I left him a small blanket, just wool and flannel stitched together. The next day, it was gone. In its place, I found that same amber-like resin spread across a cut on my hand. When I peeled it away, the wound had already begun to heal. I whispered, "Thank you," though I didn't know if he was near enough to hear. That night, I dreamed of giant footprints glowing faintly under moonlight, leading deeper into the trees. When I woke, the air was different, colder, and somewhere far off, I heard a deep, echoing call, not a roar, not a howl, something older, a sound that vibrated through the ground itself. The forest was shifting, something was coming, and I had no idea whether I was meant to fear it or follow it. But one thing was certain, I wasn't alone anymore. Have you ever learned something so simple it shattered everything you thought you knew? Not from a book, not from a teacher, but from the earth itself. That's what my days with Mino became, an education in silence. By late July, his visits were regular. Not daily, but predictable enough that I began setting aside extra food, water, and space by the fire. He always approached from the north ridge, careful not to startle me, though honestly, the ground trembled just enough to announce him every time. He never entered the cabin, always stayed outside, near the lake or by the edge of the clearing. I think he respected boundaries, his and mine. He spoke in fragments, small clusters of English words that I learned to translate through tone and gesture. Bad sky comes soon. Meant a storm was approaching. Water talk meant the river was flooding. And once, while we were sitting quietly watching the treetops sway, he said, almost to himself, "You eat, they die." At first, I didn't understand. He pointed toward the trout drying on the rack by my fire pit, then to a nearby crow picking at insects. Finally, he pressed a massive hand against his chest. "All same." I repeated it softly. "All same." He nodded, pleased that I understood even a piece of it. It wasn't about guilt, it was about balance. The give and take. The unspoken contract between everything that breathes. Later that evening, he led me on a slow walk through the forest. No trail, no compass, just instinct. He moved with impossible grace for his size, stepping between roots, ducking under branches. Every so often, he'd pause, touch a tree, listen. I could almost feel the hum through the air, like the woods had a pulse. When we reached a clearing, I saw something that took my breath away. An entire section of forest stripped bare. Stumps where trees had stood, soil turned to dust. Logging from years ago, I guessed, though I'd never seen it before. Mino stared at it a long time, then said simply, "Wrong." His voice cracked with a kind of quiet grief. Then he turned, pointing west toward the faint glow of a wildfire on the horizon. Miles away, harmless from here. Fire, good balance. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Wrong, good balance. He wasn't a monster. He was a philosopher in fur. By August, our communication grew easier. I began teaching him new words, and he taught me new ways to see. He showed me how to walk without sound. Heel to toe, weight distributed through the outer edge of the foot, eyes scanning not what's in front, but what's around. He could track a rabbit through mist, read the direction of the wind by the sway of moss, and sense weather before the clouds even formed. When I asked how he knew, He tapped his head and chest together. Listen both. That day, I finally asked him something that had haunted me since our first meeting. Why me, Mino? Why show yourself? He stared at me a long moment, the way a teacher looks at a student who's just asked the wrong question. Then, slowly, he said, you alone. Same me. It hit harder than I expected. He turned away then, crouched, and picked up a small plant with red berries. Good, he said, pointing to it, then plucked another, nearly identical, and shook his head. Bad. Poison and food, indistinguishable to anyone else, but obvious to him. He wasn't just surviving out here, he was thriving. That night, I left him a few apples on a flat stone near the lake. By morning, they were gone. In their place was a small, woven bundle of pine needles and bark, containing what looked like a fossilized insect in amber. I realized it wasn't a random exchange. It was his way of saying thank you. Every gesture carried meaning. Every silence was full of language. It happened in late August, just after dusk. The forest had gone unnaturally still again. Not the peaceful stillness of before, but a taut, waiting kind. I was returning from the lake, 2 fish slung over my shoulder, when the first growl rippled through the dark. Wolves. 5 of them, lean and hungry, eyes glowing pale in the half-light. I froze. They fanned out in a semicircle, cutting me off from the cabin. I knew enough not to run. Predators chase motion. I raised my arms, shouted, tried to look big. They didn't flinch. These wolves were desperate. Their ribs showed through their coats, their breath steaming in the cold. The leader crept forward, teeth bared. My mind raced. Rifle? Too far inside. Knife? Useless. I thought of Mino, of his calm, his balance. But even if he were near, what could he do? Then the night exploded. A roar shook the air, not an animal sound, not even human. It was primal, thunder-made flesh. The wolves yelped, spun, bolted into the trees as something enormous burst from the shadows. Mino. He charged, swinging one arm like a fallen tree trunk, slamming it into the ground where the wolves had stood seconds before. The earth quaked. They fled, tails between legs, swallowed by darkness. I stood trembling, breath ragged, as he turned toward me. For the first time, I saw him angry. Not wild, not savage, protective. His chest heaved, eyes burning with something that wasn't rage, but warning. He stepped closer, placed one massive hand on my shoulder, and said softly, "You safe now." I could barely speak. They would have killed me. He shook his head slowly. Wolves need hunt. You need live different. It wasn't judgment. It was a lesson. The wolves weren't villains. They were hungry. I was the intruder. Then, with the gentlest touch, he brushed his fingers against the torn strap on my jacket and said, "Fix." And just like that, he was gone again, into the darkness, silent as mist. That night, I didn't write in my journal. I just sat by the fire, staring into the flames, hearing that voice over and over. Wolves need hunt. You need live different. He was right. A few days later, I wanted to thank him. I wasn't sure how you repay someone for saving your life, but I figured sharing knowledge was the closest thing to fairness. So when Mino appeared again near the lake, I motioned for him to follow me to the cabin. He hesitated, sniffing the air, wary of the human scent, but finally stepped closer. I showed him my small solar setup, 2 panels propped on a wooden frame, wires leading inside to a battery bank. When I flicked on a lamp, his eyes widened, reflecting the warm glow like a child seeing fireflies for the first time. "Sun power," I said proudly, tapping the panel. He blinked, then grinned, an honest, toothy grin that made me laugh out loud. "Sun power," he repeated, the pronunciation off, but the fascination real. Then he looked at me, gestured to his chest, and said, "Mino power." He thumped his chest twice. Heart, spirit. We both laughed. And for the first time, I realized something profound. He wasn't some legend hiding from the world. He was a being choosing solitude, much like me. Maybe he'd watched humanity from the trees for generations, learning, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. When he left that evening, the sky turned gold over the lake. I stood watching until the forest swallowed him whole. The world felt bigger that night. And I felt, For the first time in years, like I belonged somewhere again. Have you ever felt the sky turn against you? Not just rain. I mean the kind of storm that feels angry, like nature itself has decided to remind you who's in charge. That's what happened the night the forest came undone. It started in late September, the way all great disasters do, quietly. The air thickened. Birds vanished. The lake, usually so full of sound, lay still like glass. Even Mino hadn't appeared in over a week. I told myself he'd gone north again, but part of me wondered if he knew something I didn't. The first thunder rolled in before sunset, a deep, slow growl that shook the ground. Then came the wind. It tore through the trees like it had a grudge, snapping branches, sending pine needles swirling through the air. By nightfall, the storm had teeth. I bolted the cabin doors, stoked the fire, and prayed the roof, patched a dozen times, would hold. Outside, rain lashed against the windows in waves. The solar panels groaned, threatening to tear loose. Every gust felt like it might rip the whole place from its foundation. Then came the sound, that terrible, splintering crack of wood giving way. A moment later, the roof above my bed caved in under the weight of a falling tree. I barely had time to move. Pain shot through my leg as the beam struck, pinning me to the floor. Rain poured through the opening, soaking everything. I tried to push it off, but it was no use. I shouted for help. Absurd, considering there was no one within 18 miles. But in that moment, instinct doesn't ask for logic. Then, somewhere beyond the roar of wind, I heard it, a sound deeper than thunder. A roar that made the storm hesitate. And suddenly, there he was. Mino. He burst through the shattered doorway like the storm itself had sent him. In one movement, he lifted the beam, something that should have taken a winch and 3 men, and tossed it aside. His eyes met mine through the rain and chaos. "Come," he said, voice booming over the wind. "Safe." He scooped me up like I weighed nothing and stepped back into the storm. The forest was a blur of rain, branches, and noise. Mino moved with purpose, his massive body shielding me from the wind. I remember clinging to him, my hands gripping coarse hair, feeling the tremor of muscle beneath. Lightning flashed, turning the world white, then black again. He carried me through terrain that should have been impossible in that weather, across a flooded creek, over fallen logs, up a slope slick with mud. I lost track of time, only aware of the rhythm of his breathing and the pounding of my own heart. Finally, he ducked into darkness, a cave. The sound of rain softened, replaced by dripping water and the distant moan of wind. He laid me gently against the wall, then knelt beside a pile of stones and began striking two together. Sparks flew. Within minutes, a small flame caught, illuminating the space. That's when I saw it. The walls shimmered faintly, streaked with mineral veins that glowed gold in the firelight. The cave wasn't big, but it was warm, safe, dry. Mino crouched nearby, watching the flames grow. I realized he wasn't just skilled. He was prepared. This wasn't his first storm. He pointed to my leg. "Hurt?" I nodded, wincing. "Just bruised, I think." Without a word, he tore a strip from the pelt around his waist and pressed it against my thigh. Then he reached into a corner, scooped a handful of clay, and smeared it gently over the bruise. It was cold, earthy, smelling faintly of moss. The pain dulled almost instantly. "You know medicine," I said. He tapped his head once. "Forest teach." The fire crackled between us. For the first time, I saw him not as some wild mystery, but as a guardian of this place. A being older than language, older than fear. After a long silence, I whispered, "Why help me?" He looked into the flames, eyes reflecting orange light. Friends help friends. The simplicity of it hit harder than any sermon I'd ever heard. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside that cave, time felt suspended. I drifted in and out of sleep. Once, I woke to find Mino feeding the fire with careful precision, arranging the logs like puzzle pieces. Every movement was slow, deliberate. I realized he wasn't just surviving the storm. He was listening to it. At one point, lightning flashed outside the cave entrance, revealing sheets of rain cascading like a waterfall. Mino turned his head, watching. "Sky angry," he said softly. But sky no hate. Sky fix. Fix. I asked groggy. He nodded. Too dry, too long. Fire need water. Balance. There it was again, that word. Balance. He understood the storm not as destruction, but as renewal. The forest's way of cleaning house. Sometime before dawn, he placed a handful of dried roots by my side and said, "Eat. Warm." They tasted bitter, but heat spread through my chest. I felt my strength return. He leaned back against the cave wall, eyes half closed, yet alert even in rest. The firelight made his first shimmer copper and gold. For a long while, I just watched him, memorizing the contours of a being no human was ever meant to see. At some point, I said quietly, "I think I was meant to meet you." He didn't answer at first. Then, without opening his eyes, he murmured, "No, you meant remember." The words sank deep. Remember what? The forest? The connection? Myself? Sleep took me before I could ask. When I woke, morning light streamed faintly through the cave mouth. The storm had passed. The air was fresh, sharp with ozone. Mino was still there, watching me, as if making sure I'd survive the night not just in body, but in spirit. "Storm gone," he said. "Now fix home." We spent 3 days repairing the cabin. Or rather, he did most of the work. I mostly hobbled around trying not to get in the way. He lifted the fallen tree like it was a broomstick, clearing debris as if he'd been born to build. I fetched nails, tools, whatever supplies I had left. When he needed leverage, I steadied the beams. Together, in silence, we rebuilt what the storm had taken. Once, as he hoisted a section of roof, I said, "You didn't have to do this." He grunted, eyes glinting. Friends help friends. It became his refrain, his truth. When the final plank was set and the roof patched, he stood back, nodding at the cabin like an artist inspecting a finished painting. Then he turned to me and said, "Balance. You help me help." I didn't understand until later. He didn't see charity as one way. Helping was the act of sharing the burden of being alive. That night, we sat by the lake under a sky washed clean by rain. Stars blinked through the lingering mist. I handed him a cup of tea, my awkward attempt at hospitality. He sniffed it suspiciously, then sipped. His eyes widened in surprise. "Hot water plant," he declared, clearly pleased. I laughed until I cried. After a long while, he said something that would stay with me forever. Humans forget belong forest. He gestured around us, to the trees, the water, the stars. All same, all connected. Then he pointed to his chest, then mine. "You wolf, tree, water, same alive die. Circle." I swallowed hard. "Circle of life?" I said softly. He nodded. "Yes, circle." When he left that night, the forest felt different, not just home, but alive in a way I'd never noticed. The air itself seemed to breathe with us. And as his silhouette vanished into the trees, I realized something simple, terrifying, and beautiful. The forest had given me back my faith, not in God, not in magic, but in connection. Have you ever noticed how the forest sounds different in autumn? Not silent, never silent, but softer, like the earth itself is taking a long, thoughtful breath before the cold. By mid-October, the forest around my cabin had changed. Maples blazed red and gold. Birches glowed pale like candlelight. The air smelled of cedar, damp leaves, and the faint sweetness of decay. I'd rebuilt most of what the storm had broken, but I wasn't the same man who had huddled beneath that shattered roof weeks before. Mino's lessons had taken root somewhere deep in me. He came less often now. Sometimes I'd glimpse him across the lake, standing motionless, watching the water. Other times I'd just find signs, enormous footprints near the trail, a half-eaten salmon left by my garden, or bundles of wild herbs hung neatly on my porch railing. Each time, I felt both his absence and his presence. He was teaching me something new, patience. One morning, the fog rolled thick over the lake. I was tending the garden, pulling up the last of the potatoes, when I heard that familiar low hum, the sound Mino made when he wanted me to follow. I turned, and there he was, half-shadowed in the mist. "You come," he said, voice calm but insistent. "Where?" I asked. "Peace Place." He turned and began walking toward the northern ridge. I grabbed my jacket and followed. We walked for what felt like miles, over mossy logs, through narrow deer trails, past places I'd never dared explore alone. The forest changed as we climbed. The trees grew older, their trunks massive, roots twisting like ancient bones. Finally, we emerged into a clearing I'd never seen before. A wide meadow stretched before us, ringed by cedar and fir. Sunlight spilled through the canopy, shimmering on dew-covered grass. In the center stood a fallen tree, hollowed by time, covered in bright green moss. A herd of elk grazed quietly nearby, unbothered by our presence. Mino raised a hand. Peace here. Always. And then he sat, cross-legged, utterly still. I joined him. We stayed like that for what must have been an hour. No words, no movement, just the sound of wind, leaves, and distant bird calls. I realized something profound in that silence. Peace wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of balance. We returned to the meadow many times after that. Sometimes Mino would show me small things. Mushrooms sprouting from a rotting stump, the pattern of ants rebuilding after rain, the way ravens clean the bones of a fallen deer. Once, he knelt beside a half-decayed carcass, bones half buried in the soil, and said, "Death, life, same." At first, I didn't understand. To me, death had always been an ending. But he looked at it differently, not as a loss, but as part of the circle he'd spoken of. He pointed at the bones. Tree feed grass. Grass feed deer. Deer feed ground. He tapped his chest. Me feed forest too. Someday. Then he looked at me. Eyes gentle, not grim. You feed too. All feed. Circle. His words sat heavy in my chest. For years I'd tried to escape the world, hide in my solitude, wall myself off from loss. But here, in the raw honesty of decay, Mino was showing me something pure. Death wasn't exile. It was contribution. One afternoon, as we gathered branches for the fire, I asked him, "Do you ever fear it?" Death. He shook his head slowly. No fear. Just time. When time right, forest take back. I stared at him, wondering if that calm acceptance came from wisdom or weariness. Maybe both. That evening, back at the cabin, I wrote in my journal, "The forest never wastes. Even in death, everything finds purpose." Maybe that's what being alive means, not to last forever, but to give something back when we're gone. By early November, frost kissed the mornings, and each breath came out white. The forest felt both alive and asleep, caught between seasons. Mino had grown quieter, still kind, still present, but his eyes carried a faraway look, as if he were already half gone. One day, he led me deeper into the woods than ever before. We reached a narrow ravine where mist rose like smoke. At the bottom lay a small pond, not more than 20 feet across, surrounded by ferns that glowed emerald against the gray sky. "This place," Mino said softly, "no death." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He knelt, scooping water in his massive hands. "Here I'll start again. Water come from deep. Always move. Never end." He gestured for me to drink. The water was ice-cold, pure, alive somehow. When I drank, I felt energy pulse through me. Not magic, not fantasy, but vitality. It was like tasting the heartbeat of the earth. "Why show me this?" I asked. He looked at me with something close to sadness. "Soon snow. I go north. Maybe not come back." The words hit me like a gust of winter wind. I opened my mouth to protest, but he raised his hand. "No sad. All circle. You learn. You teach. Balance stay." He reached into the pouch tied to his waist and pulled out a small, smooth stone, amber-colored, translucent in the fading light. He pressed it into my hand. "Keep. Remember." I wanted to ask what it meant, but before I could, he turned away, gazing out across the forest as if memorizing it. The silence between us was heavier than any words. That night, back at the cabin, I placed the stone on the windowsill. It caught the moonlight and glowed softly, like it held a piece of his fire inside. The first snow arrived quietly, like a whisper. By dawn, the world was white, every branch, every stump, blanketed in silence. The lake froze along its edges, and smoke rose from my chimney like a lonely ribbon. For days, I didn't see him. I went out to the meadow, to the ravine, to the pond, all empty. Only the faint tracks of elk and the occasional rustle of a jay. I began to wonder if he had already gone. Then, one morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, I found him standing at the edge of the lake. "Mino," I breathed. He turned, eyes reflecting the pale light. "Snow come." I go. My throat tightened. "Will you come back?" He tilted his head, considering. "Maybe not. Maybe yes." Circles say. He walked to the water's edge, gazing at his reflection, the great, wild being and the quiet man beside him. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You good human. Learn good. Teach others. Remember balance." He reached out, touched his massive hand to my forehead, a gesture like a blessing. Then he turned north, stepping into the trees. I watched him until the forest swallowed him whole. The snow fell heavier then, covering his tracks within minutes. But even after they were gone, I stood there for a long time, hand over the amber stone in my pocket, feeling the warmth that shouldn't have been there. The warmth of something real, something that would never leave, no matter how many winters came. Have you ever listened to silence so deep it is weight? The kind that doesn't comfort but presses against you, reminding you of what's missing? That's what the forest sounded like after Mino left. For the first few days, I told myself he'd just gone to higher ground, following the elk or searching for winter caves. I still set aside fruit and smoked fish on the porch, a ritual I couldn't quite abandon. But every morning, the offering was untouched. No footprints, no sign, only snow and stillness. The days shortened fast in northern Washington. By late November, the sun barely skimmed the trees before slipping away. Nights came early, long and cold. The cabin that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed hollow. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind reminded me of the absence that lingered just outside the door. I tried to keep busy, chopping firewood, repairing snares, cleaning the rifle I never used anymore. But solitude, once my refuge, had turned into a mirror. It reflected everything I didn't want to see, my fear, my smallness, my need for connection. One night, as I stared into the fire, I found the amber stone Mino had given me glowing faintly on the windowsill. Not bright, not magical, just catching the firelight like it was breathing. I held it in my palm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace instead of loss. Because I finally understood, he wasn't gone. He'd simply gone back. Back to where everything goes. The circle he'd shown me. The endless exchange between life and death, giving and taking, being and belonging. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel separate from it. I felt part of it. Winter deepened. The lake froze solid. The sky turned the color of old pewter. I began to write. At first, it was just to remember the details. The smell of pine smoke in the cave, the sound of his voice saying balance, the way his laughter rumbled like distant thunder. But soon it became something else, a promise. He had told me, "You learn good. Teach others." So I began writing not for myself, but for whoever might read these pages after I was gone. I wrote about the way Mino moved through the forest, not as a conqueror, but as part of it. How he saw death not as cruelty, but as the breath that keeps life alive. How he taught me that peace isn't found in isolation or control, but in surrender to the rhythm of what already exists. I filled notebooks with drawings, maps of the trails he showed me, descriptions of plants, their uses, their seasons. I even described his language, the fragments of English he used, the gestures that carried more meaning than entire paragraphs. There were nights when I stopped writing because tears blurred the ink. Not from sadness, exactly, but from awe. The awe of having witnessed something real and ancient, something that made every other belief I'd ever held seem too small. I started thinking that maybe Mino wasn't the strange one. Maybe we are. Maybe it's us who've lost the language of the living world, the one that doesn't need words at all. And so, I wrote with one hope, that someday, someone would read this journal and feel the same stirring that I did. The reminder that we're not above nature. We're not guests here. We belong. By late February, the forest began to thaw. Snow melted into rivulets that sang down the hillside, and the lake cracked open in long, echoing sighs. I was standing by the water's edge one morning when I noticed something half buried in the melting snow. A branch snapped clean in two, with marks that looked almost like finger grooves. I lifted it, heart pounding, though I knew it wasn't proof of anything. But I smiled anyway, because it didn't matter. Proof wasn't the point. The forest didn't owe me evidence. It had already given me understanding. In spring, I planted more than I ever had before: potatoes, beans, squash, rows of carrots. Not just for me, but for everything else that lived nearby. I built small feeding shelves for birds and deer, even left spaces in the garden unplanted so wildflowers could grow. And somehow, the land responded. Rabbits returned. A family of ducks nested near the lake. The air itself felt warmer, fuller. Life had come back, not because I controlled it, but because I finally joined it. Sometimes, at dusk, I would sit on the porch and imagine I saw him, a shadow moving between trees, tall and silent. Maybe it was just wishful thinking. Maybe not. Once, just before the sun set, I thought I heard his voice on the wind. Faint, low, but unmistakable. Balance. I smiled and whispered back, I remember. It's been 7 years now since that storm. Since the night he carried me through wind and rain. No one believes my story, of course. I've told it a few times, in town, to the occasional reporter, even to a park ranger. Most nod politely, then change the subject. That's fine. I've stopped needing belief. Because belief is for things you don't know. What I have is knowing. I still live in the same cabin, though it's sturdier now. I've rebuilt the solar panels, repaired the roof, expanded the garden. But I no longer live here to escape people. I live here to remember what he taught me. Every spring, I return to the meadow where the elk graze. Every summer, I visit the hidden pond and drink from it, not out of superstition, but gratitude. Every autumn, I leave offerings of berries and roots beneath the cedar tree near the lake. And every winter, when the first snow falls, I light a fire and set the amber stone by the window. It glows faintly in the firelight, and I whisper the only prayer that ever felt true. Friends help friends. All same, all connected. Maybe one day, when I'm gone, someone else will find this cabin. Maybe they'll find my journal, or the stone, or nothing at all. Maybe they'll just feel something different in the air, a quiet, invisible thread that ties everything together. If they do, I hope they understand what I finally did, that the forest is not something to conquer, or to fear, or even to protect out of guilt. It's something to return to. Because in the end, that's what Mino taught me, the secret of every living thing. We are never really alone. We are never really separate. We just forget. And when we remember, even for a moment, the world breathes easier. If this story touched something in you, that quiet reminder that we all belong to something greater, then carry it forward. Let's rebuild that balance, one shared story at a time. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering that connection starts with awareness. Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment myself. If you found meaning here, hit like, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the wild and the human heart. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, we are all connected.